I know I gave you a quiz just 2 lectures ago, but here's a quick and easy challenge for you. Which of these white wines is younger? If you said the one on the right, you're correct. Remember, as a white wine ages, it gains color and moves towards the more deeper goldish hues. Now, here I have 2 reds. Which one of these is older? Well, if you said the one on the right, you're correct. As a red wine ages, it loses its color and takes on more of the orange and tawny kind of hues. You see, you're able to tell so much at this point just by looking at the glass. Today we're covering the wines of South America, primarily Chile and Argentina. You're going to need the following wines: a Sauvignon Blanc from Chile, a Sancerre from France, a Carmenere from Chile, a Cabernet Sauvignon from Chile, a Torrontés from Argentina, and a Malbec from Argentina. The wines of Chile and Argentina have really grown in popularity in the United States, especially in the past few years. Sommeliers many times will use wines from these 2 countries for their by-the-glass offerings, and they're incredible values for money, and I mean that at all price points. Chile is a long and narrow country on the southwestern coast of South America. It's situated between the Pacific and the snow-capped Andes Mountains, the highest mountain range outside of Asia and the longest mountain range on the planet. This has kept and still keeps Chile somewhat isolated, which, as you'll see in a minute, had an important effect on the wine industry. The Europeans' first glimpse of Chile came when Magellan discovered the passage to the Pacific, what's now called the Strait of Magellan. About a decade or so later, the Spanish conquistadors traveled down to Chile from Peru looking for gold. The conquistadors didn't find gold, but they did find conditions perfect for agriculture. Most of Chile's wines are produced between 32 and 38 south degrees latitude. If we compared these latitudes in the northern hemisphere, the range would match from about the southern tip of Spain to North Africa, and incidentally, Texas. This means Chile gets much more sunshine hours per year than you might expect. But if that's the case, you'd think it would be really hot, right? Not really. Not only do you have the maritime influence from the Pacific Ocean, but you also have the impact of the Humboldt Current. The Humboldt Current is a marine current that flows from the southern tip of Chile northward. The marine air is cooled by this current, so there's less precipitation in this region. As a result, fungal disease is less of an issue than it is in Europe. I mentioned an advantage that Chile has because of its isolation. Can you guess what it is? Well, without a lot of interaction with a lot of countries, not much phylloxera has found its way there. The louse has found its way to Argentina, but I guess they can't hop their way over the Andes. Just kidding. Without the problem of phylloxera, Chile's producers can plant on their original Vitis vinifera rootstocks, and that makes Chile unique as a wine producer. The snow-capped Andes also supply Chile with a large amount of water for its irrigation. With fungal disease less of an issue, plenty of hours of sunshine, all the water they want, and no phylloxera, Chile is a viticultural paradise. These conditions also make organic viticulture easier. We'll be tasting the wines of Di Martino, which is an organic producer from Chile. Maipo is the most famous wine region of Chile. It surrounds Santiago and the Maipo River, which flows from the Andes to the Pacific Ocean. It has 3 main areas. First, the Alto Maipo, which is closer to the Andes, so it's at a higher elevation, and it's known for its bold red wines. Second, the Central Maipo, which is due south of Santiago around the Maipo River. Last, the Coastal Maipo, which is a much cooler region with its maritime influence from the Pacific. Sauvignon Blanc is not the most predominant grape variety in Maipo, but they do grow it, as you see here with the Di Martino Chilean Sauvignon Blanc. So let's look at it. Here we have a very pale color, as it would be. It's a Sauvignon Blanc, pale straw with a little bit of a greenish hue. And I get very citrusy notes, but also get a hint of something more herbaceous, like some strong grassy tones. Let's taste it. It's quite high in acidity, as you would expect for Sauvignon Blanc, because Sauvignon Blanc is a high acid grape, but it's quite delicate. I get a little bit of a floral character on the retronasal flavors that I get there. And it's really quite nice. Light-bodied, crisp, and very bright. One of the challenges in studying Chilean wines is that the varieties weren't properly identified for many years. Many of the Sauvignon Blanc vine cuttings came to Chile from Bordeaux during the 19th century. At that time, there was no clear distinction between mass selection and specific clones. So Sauvignon Blanc is Sauvignon Blanc is Sauvignon Blanc, right? Well, in this case, mixed into the mass selections was the great Sauvignon Vert and Sauvignon Gris, among others. And so although Chileans thought they had just planted Sauvignon Blanc, they actually had all of these other different grape varieties mixed willy-nilly in the vineyards. So why does this matter? Well, these other varieties are not as aromatic or as noble a grape variety as Sauvignon Blanc. So if you taste the Chilean Sauvignon Blanc against true Sauvignon Blanc, it wouldn't have the true Sauvignon Blanc character. It was only in the 1990s that French experts went to Chile to really identify what was there in those vineyards. There's an entire field of study concerned with the identification and classification of grapevines. It's called ampelography. Ampelography compares vines for similarities and differences. For example, they look at the color and the shape of the leaves, and they count how many sinuses it has, which I call fingers. It is a very subtle science. Since the vines underwent these tests, many vines have been grafted over to true Sauvignon Blanc. However, it's uncertain whether what some producers are labeling as Sauvignon Blanc is really Sauvignon Vert or maybe even some other grape. On some labels, you'll just see the word Sauvignon, or sometimes in the back label, it'll say that it's 50% Sauvignon Blanc and 50% Sauvignonness, which is Sauvignon Vert. Sometimes producers will harvest Sauvignon Blanc early to retain the acidity and keep some of that herbaceous character. So let's show you just how herbaceous it can be. Here, taste the Sancerre. We've tasted Sancerre quite a few times in this series, so I hope you still have some on hand. So when we smell the Sancerre, we get some light citrus kind of tones. And when we smell the Chilean Sauvignon Blanc, it has a little bit more herbaceous character. However, it also has some more upfront fruit. Again, this points us to the New World, where you get more mineral tones in the Sancerre. But do you get the more green, grassy, herbaceous notes in the Chilean Sauvignon Blanc? Now let's taste the Sancerre. And taste the Chilean Sauvignon Blanc. The Chilean Sauvignon Blanc is a bit riper and rounder in its character, and the acidity is not quite as high as in Sancerre, but it's still quite delicate and crisp. But do you notice some of the warmth on the back palate? That's more pointing you towards a warmer climate than in Sancerre, which is what Chile is known for. My general benchmark for Chilean wines in a blind tasting is green. There's a strong element of herbaceousness here, especially in their herbaceous varieties such as Sauvignon Blanc, but also Cabernet Sauvignon. One of the most beautiful and fun wineries to visit in Maipo is Viña Haras de Perque. The owner is also an esteemed thoroughbred breeder, and the winery is actually in the shape of a horseshoe. They also have a partnership with the famous super Tuscan producer Antinori, which we spoke about in Lecture 14. The Antinoris are not the only Old World producers who've been attracted to Chile. The Grand Marque Champagne House of Moet and Chandon is invested in Maipo, where they've set up a sparkling wine facility. Now, Casablanca, not the one you've seen in the Humphrey Bogart movies, is one of the coolest grape-growing regions in Chile. They're known for their white wines in general, but they're known in particular for their Sauvignon Blanc. This region is much closer to the Pacific than Maipo, so it's a bit cooler, although the altitude is lower. There are cool morning fogs here as well, similar to what you see in the cool region of Carneros in Northern California. And frost here is a major concern. Given its proximity to the ocean, there's also more cloud cover. They don't have as many days of sunshine as, say, the Alto Maipo, which has up to 300 clear days of sunshine a year. However, because of being closer to the equator than France, for instance, the fruit can ripen on the vine a bit longer. As we've seen in other countries, these riper grapes retain acidity and aromas. So Chile's Chardonnays take on a more tropical fruit tone of pineapple. However, this is balanced by the fresh acidity. As a result of all of these conditions, this is where some of the more elegant Chilean wines come from. So if you're in the mood for a New World upfront fruit Chardonnay, but you want it to be a bit more acidic, look for a Casablanca on the label. Let's go south of Maipo to the region of Rapel. This area has subregions such as Colchagua, where the highest concentration of Chile's flagship grape, Carmenere, is grown. Just like Sauvignon Blanc, Carmenere had a bit of its own identity crisis in Chile. I mentioned that in the 19th century, vines were brought over from Bordeaux, right? Well, that was before the troubles with phylloxera began, and at that time, Carmenere took a back seat to Merlot in terms of importance in Bordeaux. So a lot more Carmenere came over. However, Merlot and Carmenere look very similar. And when the mass selections from Bordeaux were planted in Chile and then propagated for the last century or so, it was very hard to tell the difference between the two. It was only in the mid-1990s that the two varieties were officially recognized as different in Chile, and varietal bottlings of Carmenere have only been permitted since 1998. So let's compare and contrast the Carmenere with the Cabernet Sauvignon, which we've tasted before. And Chile is also known for its high-quality Cabernet Sauvignon as well. So let's take these two and look at the color. Well, you can tell that Carmenere is a thick-skinned grape variety because it's just as deep color, if not deeper for this one, than the Cabernet Sauvignon. It's moderately aromatic in comparison to, just as moderately aromatic as the Cab. The aromas that you get for Carmenere are more like grilled meat. You do have fruit there, so you do have some like black cherry fruit, but and maybe in a little black currant, but you don't have that herbaceousness there, not like green bell pepper, which you're probably going to get with the Chilean Cabernet Sauvignon. If you don't know the difference between these two and you don't taste the green bell pepper, go back and forth in aromas between these two, then you'll really be able to get the green bell pepper in the Chilean Cab. But Carmenere also has an element of coffee and soy sauce, actually. We talked about that in Spain a little bit. So let's taste it. It's full-bodied. And it does have some gripping tannins, but not as gripping as Cabernet Sauvignon. But the acidity is lower. Cabernet Sauvignon has a higher level of acidity, and if you want, taste versus the Cabernet Sauvignon to be able to perceive that. But it does have a chocolatey texture, doesn't it? And even though it's got some gripping tannins, it's lower than Cabernet Sauvignon. Some producers, though they're liberal with their new oak, which is generally French, not American, they do that to give it a boost of tannins. Now, though I didn't ask you to get a Chilean Merlot, you may want to come back to this lecture and taste them side by side for fun, meaning Carmenere and Merlot, as well as for your own personal knowledge to get your own benchmarks. You also see Syrah in Colchagua, which would be exciting to taste as well. Below Colchagua is the region of Curic, where Miguel Torres, a famous high-quality Spanish wine producer, invested in the late 1970s. He now exports Chilean wines to over 70 countries. It's this region and that of the Maule to the south that unfortunately saw some of the roughest devastation from the earthquake in 2010. In Curic, Miguel Torres still has a winery and buildings, but others weren't so lucky. Some wineries reported that their tanks collapsed and poured out millions of liters of wine. However, the overall damage for the entire Chilean industry may not be as bad as we think. The average figure for the lost wine appears to be about 12.5%. To the north, there is a region called Aconcagua, which, like Maipo, is named for the river that runs through it. This is home to one of the largest exporting producers, Errázuriz. Towards the interior of the region, red grape varieties have flourished, particularly because it's one of Chile's hottest and driest regions. You rarely see clouds in the summer, so it's a great place to visit. Which brings me to a good point. If you want to visit Chile when there are grapes on the vines or during the excitement of harvest, don't go in July or August. Why? Because that's their winter. In the southern hemisphere, harvest can begin in January and generally runs through April, depending on the area and varieties, so make sure you plan your trips well. In international markets, we see much more Chilean wine, but Chile only makes about half as much as Argentina. What comes to mind when you think of Argentina? Maybe you picture tango dancers or the Broadway musical Evita, the story of Eva Perón. What you might not realize is Argentina is the largest producer of wine in South America and the 5th largest wine producer in the world. If you don't know why, just wait, you will. Argentina's capital, Buenos Aires, is on the east coast of the country, but many of Argentina's vineyards are planted closer to the Andes Mountains and are at some of the highest elevations in the world. Actually, it's much faster to take a plane from Santiago, Chile, to the wine regions of Argentina than it is from Buenos Aires. Remember in Lecture 3 when we talked about altitude? For every 100 meters you go up in altitude, the temperature drops about 1 degree Celsius. However, the great inclination of the slopes improves drainage, which in turn helps the grapes ripen. Also, the higher the elevation, the higher the ultraviolet radiation, which stimulates richer tannin creation. Unlike in Chile, we do see phylloxera in Argentina, but it's quite limited because of the high altitude and the high proportion of sand in the soil. We'll visit Salta first, because it's a very up-and-coming area that's attracting a lot of attention to Argentina. Salta is also the highest vineyards in the world. As the average elevation is more than a mile high, it can get almost up to 10,000 feet above sea level. Just to give you an idea of how high that is, it's almost double the elevation of Denver, Colorado, which we call the mile-high city in the United States. Salta is small and represents a tiny percentage of all the vines in the country, but it's famous for a powerfully aromatic and beautiful white wine we haven't seen yet, Torrontés. This is Argentina's flagship white grape and a specialty. So let's take a look at it. Notice the color. This is pale straw, but you do see a wide variety here. Sometimes you'll see it pale straw, sometimes you'll see it a little bit stronger in its straw. I can smell it already. It's a very aromatic grape variety. What you get is a little bit of a lemony character, and I've often confused this grape for muscat, but there's also an element of spice in it. But what is that spice? Can you name that? When I was first studying, I went to this great event, Argentina tasting, and I was walking around and I was behind this chef that was walking from table to table. And I heard him talking about Torrontés, and he had a specific benchmark that he set. So I was really excited. I ran home, I scoured my spice rack, and I found it. Coriander. Coriander has a very lemony, spicy kind of note. And this became my new benchmark for Torrontés. Now, if you have coriander in your spice rack or in your cabinet, go get it and smell it and come back and see if it smells like that. But let's taste it right now. For a white wine, it's fairly full-bodied. It's got a round texture. It's a little bit more generous. But notice how the acidity is quite low. It's also similar to muscat. But in Salta, because it has that higher altitude, we see a higher acidity here than perhaps other parts of Chile, but it's still quite low. You also notice some of the warmth on your back palate. And, that's also because it's, the New World, and it's a little bit of a warmer climate. This low acid warm alcohol structure is probably one of the reasons why it's enjoyed more in its youth than it is for its ability to age. There are 3 types of Torrontés, but on the label you'll only see Torrontés. DNA profiling suggests that the 2 of the 3 are a cross between Muscat of Alexandria and Criolla Chica, which is the same as the mission grape of California we talked about in lecture 17 and was very popular with the Spanish settlers in South America. Now let's go to the most important wine region in Argentina, Mendoza. I say important because it produces 80% of the country's wine volume. It's also the largest region. To put this into perspective for you, Mendoza is about the size of Finland. It's lower in altitude than Salta, but it's still nearly a mile high. The climate here is continental because it's so far inland, and they have 4 seasons. The annual rainfall is low, about 1/6 the rainfall of Bordeaux. But fortunately, most of it falls during the summer months, which encourages growth. The soil here is alluvial, which means it's similar to what you see around rivers. And it's loose and sandy with some clay. Because of the low amount of rainfall, along with the well-draining soils, grape growers need to irrigate. Instead of using irrigation tubes along the vines, they use flood irrigation. In this system, water is fed along dug channels through rows of the vines. The land is pretty flat, so they can irrigate in this way, but they're able to do this despite the overall elevation. The major grape variety planted here is Malbec. You heard me mention Malbec before, as it's one of the varieties used in Bordeaux. In France, though, it's known as Cot, C-O-T. And some of the highest quality Malbecs in France come from the AC of Cahors in southwest France. Just like in Chile, Malbec came over in mass selections from France to Argentina. Malbec is Argentina's flagship red grape, but it wasn't always so. And we almost lost it due to the politics and economics of the day. In 1920, Argentina was the 8th wealthiest nation in the world, but political turmoil after the deposing of the Perons led to a deep economic depression. In an ill-advised attempt to revive the economy, the government paid vintners to pull up their Malbec vines in favor of higher-producing, lesser-quality vines. It didn't have the effect they were hoping for, as you might have guessed. To make a bad situation worse, many of these were old vines that would have given rich, concentrated fruit. This practice was put to a stop when people realized that Malbec was a unique variety for them to focus on, something they could call all their own. Now let's take a look at the Malbec now, and you'll be glad that the vines were ultimately saved. This one's a medium ruby, but I've seen ones that are actually quite inky and dark. It's about moderate aromatic intensity, but what I do get is dark fruit. It's like dark cherry, dark blackberries, plums. And there's a word that you'll see in a lot of, probably a lot of British descriptions of grape varieties, like Merlot in particular, as well as Malbec, damson. And damson is a type of plum used for jams, and you definitely get that here. Now, one benchmark that I have, for Malbec, is one of my favorite flavors in the world, is mocha, which is that combination between chocolate and coffee. But sometimes you can get a woodsy kind of bramble note, but this adds layers of complexity. Let's taste it. This one's full-bodied. And it too has a modest acidity when you compare it to Cabernet Sauvignon. But it's rich, it's concentrated, it's dense, and it's got some firm tannins. But again, not as gripping as Cabernet Sauvignon. Remember we were talking about the flying winemakers in an earlier lecture? This blend Malbec over here is from one of the most famous, Michel Rolland. Originally from Pomerol, Michel Rolland consulted on some of the best-rated classified growths in Bordeaux. He's known for making wines that are deep in color, rich, dense, concentrated, yet supple, which this one is. Michel Rolland has a big fan in the wine critic Robert Parker, who has said there may be no finer red wine value in Argentina. The great thing about this wine, with its incredible complexity and powerful flavor, is that it's only $16. This is why it has become the darling of sommeliers everywhere for their lists of wines by the glass. You can get a very reasonably priced wine with a ton of flavor here. The second most widely grown red grape in Argentina is Bonarda. It's difficult to identify the exact origins of the Bonarda that you find in Argentina because it's the name of 3 different grapes in Piedmont, in Italy, and some believe it might be a different grape variety entirely than those. It doesn't have the color or density of Malbec, but whenever I've tasted it, it's always reminded me of Barbera with its high acidity and medium body. However, it has a very dark fruit character with a hint of licorice. Some winemakers are even blending it with Syrah, which sounds pretty exciting. After Mendoza, the second most important region is San Juan. It's farther north, and although its altitude is similar to Mendoza, it's much hotter and drier. A large portion of its volume is exported as grape concentrate. They also make brandy and vermouths here in this region. South, towards Patagonia, you come to the region of Rio Negro. This is the lowest in altitude, only about 1,000 feet above sea level. Rio Negro is somewhat cooler than Mendoza, and much cooler than the region of San Juan. It also has some chalky soils, which makes it an excellent environment for aromatic varieties such as Torrontés and Sauvignon Blanc, as well as cool climate varieties such as Pinot Noir and Chardonnay. Now we come to an interesting find that's going to make you look like a superstar if you mention it to sommeliers and wine geeks. Tannat. Tannat is a black grape that they grow in Argentina, but let me tell you where it's turning heads. Uruguay. It arrived in Uruguay in 1870, carried by immigrants from southwest France, which is where it makes a very high-quality wine in the appellation of Madiran. Never had an Uruguayan wine? Well, that's not surprising, as most people in the industry haven't. However, this little grape variety is making people take notice. We have a Carmenere as the flagship for Chile, Malbec for Argentina, and likely Tannat as Uruguay's unique flagship. Looks like everyone needs one. And you know what? We're going to talk about this again when we get to South Africa in Lecture 22. Uruguay may be the 4th most important wine country in South America, but that doesn't say very much because what they produce is minuscule in comparison to Argentina. But they do have a similar annual production to, say, New Zealand, so it's not too small. Uruguay gets the same amount of sunshine as Chile and Argentina, but it's much cooler given the influence of the Atlantic and cold Antarctic breezes. This means that its wines are generally a little lower in alcohol and a little higher in acidity than Chile or Argentina. Tannat is a powerhouse of a grape. It's a big boy. Just how big? Just to give you an idea, in France, Cabernet Sauvignon is blended in to soften it. Known for rich blackberry fruit, Tannat has some of the strongest tannins, besides Nebbiolo, which is probably where its name came from, Tannat, tannin. Can I get it? In Uruguay, Merlot is often used to soften its enormous structure. Winemakers use Tannat to make different styles, from rosé to tannic Bordeaux-like wines to fortified wines that I've seen on some lists in New York. It's a great value and an interesting conversation piece at a client dinner or a date. Next up, we go to the wines of Australia. Australia does it all. Cool climate, warm climate, French oak, American oak, white varieties, red varieties, sparkling, sweet, and fortified. It also makes the #1 wine imported into the United States. You'll need the following Australian wines for the next lecture. An Australian Riesling from either Eden or Claret Valley in South Australia, a Semillon from the Hunter or Barossa Valley, or a Semillon blend, you might find that, an oaked Chardonnay from anywhere in Australia, a Barossa Shiraz, or you might find one from McLaren Vale, that would work as well, a Rhone Valley Syrah, so Crozes Hermitage, Cornas, or Saint-Joseph. We covered this already in another lecture, so that'll be old hat to you, and a Cabernet Sauvignon from Coonawarra. Australia makes wines at every price point, and we see them more and more all over the world. The Australians will also likely go down in history as the country that had the most influence on the wine world in the late 20th century. And until then, hasta luego and cheers.